Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Comic Arts Forum Roundtable on Comics Publishing. My name is Qiana Whitted, and I'm the chair of ICAF, and I study comics as a professor of English and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. Moderating this virtual panel with me is my colleague and fellow comics scholar, Andrew Kunka. He's a professor of English and a division chair at the University of South Carolina in Sumter. This roundtable is part of a series of online events for our virtual conference that includes a weekly blog and academic panels with some of the best scholarship on comics being produced today. You can see the full schedule of our activities by visiting internationalcomicartsforum.org. Today we're asking, what can researchers, teachers, and fans learn about the exciting new graphic novel imprints that are debuting right now? What does the process of curating, editing, and marketing these comics tell us about the way the field is growing? We are delighted to be joined today by editors Gina Gagliano from Random House Graphic, John Jennings from Megascope with ABRAMS Books, and Kendra Boileau from Graphic Mundi at Penn State University Press. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic to Andy.
Thanks, Qiana. I'm really happy to be here and excited to have this conversation with these three editors. So to start off with then, let's have everybody introduce themselves in a little more detail and talk a bit about the publishing line or imprint that you oversee. And we'll start with Kendra.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for having me on this panel. So I am the Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief of Penn State University Press. I have been publishing graphic novels at the press since 2015 in a book series called Graphic Medicine. And that series is edited by Susan Squire and Ian Williams. More recently, I've become the publisher at the press of a new trade graphic novel imprint called Graphic Mundi. We will be launching our first offerings in February of 2021 with 7 new titles. And I can talk more about those a little later in the session.
All right. Thanks. Let's go ahead to John.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to be on this wonderful panel with my colleagues and friends. My name is John Jennings. I am a professor of media and cultural study at the University of California at Riverside, where I teach courses on Afrofuturism and visual culture, comics and contemporary culture, and classes on Afrofuturism and visual cultures of horror. So basically, I get to teach all the cool stuff in media studies. My background is in visual art. For 20 years, I taught as a graphic design professor, and I'm also a comic scholar. And I'm also a 2-time Eisner winner for my research on race and comics with Black of the Ink, and also for the adaptation of Octavia Butler's Kindred with Damien Duffy for best adaptation. And basically now I run the new imprint Megascope. Our first book will be out from ABRAMS Books in January. And we're very excited about the first few titles that we're doing. And I can't wait to share with you more about what we're getting into.
Great. And Gina, can you go ahead?
Great. I'm Gina Gagliano. I'm the publishing director of Random House Graphic. Thanks so much for having me here. And it's great to be talking with Qiana and Andy and John and Kendra, and also amazing to be talking to all of you comics scholars. So Random House Graphic is the oldest of the new imprints here, which means that we started 10 months ago in January 2020. So this year has been an interesting year for us on a number of fronts, but over the past 10 months, we've published 12 graphic novels, and we're a dedicated kids and YA imprint. So our books are for ages 4 up through college age. And our motto is a graphic novel on every bookshelf, which means, our goal is to be publishing every kind of book and for every reader out there.
Great, thanks, Gina. So we can circle back now to Kendra, and get into a little more detail about Graphic Mundi. And one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about it is Penn State's graphic medicine series, which has been going on for a while and put out some great stuff. And I've loved everything that has come out from that so far, that Susan Squire and Ian Williams are editing. Can you talk a bit about the relationship between Graphic Mundi and graphic medicine? Because from looking at the books that you're showing here, some of these seem to fit into what Penn State University Press has already been doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so the graphic medicine book series was devised to publish scholarship on comics and graphic medicine, and also trade graphic novels. We actually thought we would be publishing more scholarship to start with, and then bringing on occasional graphic novels, but it turned out to be the opposite, that we've published about more than 20 graphic novels in the graphic medicine series since 2015. And most of these narratives are stories about stories that are set in traditional healthcare or hospice settings, about people struggling with illness, disability, what it's like to practice medicine, what it's like to be a caregiver, grieving and mourning about the loss of a loved one. In more recent years, say within the past year and a half, we have decided to break free a little bit from the confines of stories that are set in healthcare settings, and sort of consider stories that are set in the wider world, relating to people's experiences as embodied subjects intersecting with and interacting with others in an increasingly troubled social, political, and natural environments, climate change, for example, and war and migration, that sort of thing. So these are stories that tend to highlight cultural diversity and difference. And I can give two examples of books that we published in graphic medicine, the series. One is, there are stories about experiences in war. One is called Vanny, and it's the story of a family, their multi-generational experience in the Sri Lankan Civil War. It's an amazing book. It's hardly, it's very moving. And also we have more recently, I guess just a month or so ago, we published Algérienne, which is a translation from a French graphic novel, and it's about the history of women in the Algerian War, a story that's not quite often told, and it's told through a series of fictionalized female characters that are based in historical facts. And the narrative is kind of cool because the stories of the stories of each of these women intersect throughout the graphic novel. So those were published in graphic medicine, and we had consciously started to broaden out our offerings, not reject, you know, the formative projects that we brought in the series, but just add to it, and scale it up, as it were. And so Graphic Mundi really is an extension and a continuation of the graphic medicine line. In some ways, it was a marketing decision. To what we wanted to do was publish our trade graphic novels in a trade imprint, for marketing reasons. And then now we're going to be using the graphic medicine series as a series for scholarship on comics and graphic medicine. It was a little tricky publishing scholarship and trade graphic novels in one imprint, we found. So consolidating the graphic novels, whether they're, you know, what we call graphic medicine, or a bit farther afield from that, seemed like a smart marketing tack to take. And that's what Graphic Mundi is, an extension, a continuation of that line. And so we'll continue to host the graphic medicine narrative set in medical settings. In the fall, we have a very moving story about a woman who was diagnosed with leukemia and ends up, well, I won't, spoiler alert, I won't tell you, but that's a wonderful and moving story. But we also have, you know, some of the farther afield stories, like we've got a Syrian migrant narrative, which is a 3-volume series coming out, which I'm really excited about. We have a graphic novel about Iranian women's feelings about their love lives. So more socially relevant topics, I guess you would say. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I want to say is this whole idea of scaling up is, we're following the lead of Susan Squire, who I'm sure many of you know. She is the Professor Emeritus of English, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Penn State University Press. She's the co-editor for the graphic medicine series. I met her soon after I arrived at Penn State in 2010. And she just got me totally hooked on graphic medicine, you know, and we started the series at Penn State. But over the course of her career and her interaction with her work with graphic medicine, she's been really pushing to scale up this whole idea of health, to encompass narratives about not just humans, but also non-human animals and microbes, and how we all intersect and intersect in sort of a more global context, as it were. So that's kind of, it's a little confusing to people. We're not rejecting graphic medicine. We're basically continuing graphic medicine in the graphic Mundi line, just rebranding it for marketing reasons. And I'm in the process of appointing a board for that imprint, which will include some of these pioneers of graphic medicine who I've worked with for years on the series. I think, does that clarify? Does that respond to your question, Andy?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I was lucky to be, or when the graphic medicine line started early on, I was lucky to be on the mailing list for that and got those books, and I really loved what you were all doing there. And when I saw the graphic Mundi line announced, I thought this just seems like a logical outcome of the growth of what I was seeing in the number of books that I was getting from your list. So that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yep.
So John, kind of a similar question here, because you know your Megascope's with ABRAMS, and that's where your Octavia Butler adaptations came from, Kindred and Parable of the Sower. So can you talk a little bit about how Megascope ended up there? Was it connected to those books?
Yeah, definitely. So as you're stating, Andy, the two adaptations of Octavia Butler's work are with Abrams Comic Arts, which has been I think they're now over 10 years publishing not only books that are graphic novels, but books about comics, is where they kind of started. So the Kirby book and, things of that nature. And they kind of segued into doing graphic novels. And so, like I said, they just celebrated like their 10th year. So it's a sub imprint of Comic Arts. So what happens is I was actually talking to the publisher, Andrew Smith, about the success of the Octavia Butler books. And, I just basically state like, well, there are other people of color who are writing speculative fiction, besides Octavia Butler, who's amazing, but there's, so many more people. And, he stated that, if we wanted to try to do more adaptations, then let him know, and we try to make that happen. But I was like, well, I was thinking original content. And then he was like, well, that sounds like an imprint. And I was like, yes, it does. And so that's essentially how it happened. And so I sent them a write-up about what I thought Megascope would be. The name comes from a W.E.B. Du Bois science fiction story called The Princess Steel, which was discovered in his papers by two wonderful scholars, Adrian Brown and Britt Russert. And I think the original story, as I recall, was written in the early 1900s, like 1905, 1909, something like that. And the Megascope was used as a framing mechanism for the story. And the story itself is about his critiques of the American steel industry. But he used and so the Megascope itself is brilliant, actually. The Megascope itself is a device, a diegetic prototype, if you will, that actually allows you to see through time and space into other realities. And I just thought it would be a great name for an imprint about by and about people of color and speculation. I'm gonna do the spiel as far as like what we do. Is that okay? I can just read it, that way we can, yeah. So Megascope is dedicated to showcasing speculative and nonfiction works by and about people of color, with a focus on science fiction, fantasy, horror, history, and stories of magical realism. The Megascope is a fictional device imagined by W.B. Du Bois that can peer through time and space into realities, other realities, like I said. This magical invention represents the idea that so much of our collective past has not seen the light of day, and there is so much history that we have yet to discover. Megascope will serve as a lens through which we can broaden our view of history, the present, and the future, and as a method by which previously unheard voices can find their way to an ever-growing, diverse audience. And so we've been looking at primarily speculative fiction by and about people of color. The first book that we're doing is it's a short story that I fell in love with years ago. I'm good friends with Nnedi Okorafor, this Nigerian American, or as she says, Nigerian American science fiction writer. And On the Road is one of my favorite short stories of hers because I'm a horror fanatic, and it's just one of her only like horror stories. It presents itself as a horror story, but actually it's not. It's more of a story about self realization, essentially. And I've been wanting to adapt it for about 8 years or so, right? And I thought it would be a great title to kind of start off with. And so I had actually broken down the story myself, but then I was busy working on Parable Solar, so I got my friend David Brame to be the artist. I did the colors on it and the adaptation of it, and we decided to call it After the Rain to disambiguate it from the Jack Kerouac story. So because it's on the road. So anyway, yeah, and so these first few books are coming out 2021. Should I go into like details about them? I don't want to take up too much time, but this is only the first smattering. We actually have a bunch of other stuff we're working on. Some things we haven't announced yet too, of course, but I don't want to burn up a lot of time.
No, feel free. I'm really curious about these anyway, because I've seen the announcement about After the Rain and the Heavy, and the others.
Yes, I'll go through them really quickly. So we just finished. We're just finishing up this quick primer about the Tulsa Race Massacre called Across the Tracks, and it's basically it's a nonfiction introduction to the building of the Greenwood District and also its subsequent destruction and rebuilding, because a lot of people forget that right after the massacre, they rebuilt almost immediately. That's never really focused on. It's always about, oh, these poor people were disenfranchised and destroyed by this thing, and then that's the end. But no, it actually didn't end there. And so so we decided to do it. We crashed our schedule, so to speak. I was actually chatting with Charlie Cochran about it, and I told him, like, on top of everything that's been going on in the world, we just celebrated the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he's like, oh, can we do something for the 100th? And I was like, maybe. And so it's a very short piece. It's only about 50 or so pages, which is very different for what they do. But it has a 48-page comic and then like a really, really great contextualizing essay by Dr. Ronaldo Anderson, who actually went to school in Oklahoma, and also Dr. Colette Yellowrobe, who is a Native American scholar, because people forget the Osage people are also part of the conversation as far as like the formation of Oklahoma. So the idea is to have a primer for teachers, people who just want to learn something about that particular incident. Also, Black Star, which is due out, I'm looking at my little schedule, hold on, spring 2021. And it's by Anthony Glover and Ariel Jabalanos. And I always think of it as like Annihilation in Space, but with some corporate espionage thrown in for good measure. It's about this all-women crew of astronauts who go into deep space looking for the cure for cancer on this distant planet. But one of them is a corporate spy and destroys the entire expedition to try to get the flower, the cure for themselves. But you don't know who the culprit is. And it's based on a screenplay by Anthony, and it's really wonderful. And I love the artwork, and I think it's going to be a really cool book. Hard Ears. Hard Ears is by Matthew Clark and Nigel Lynch, and It's okay. So it's basically if you took the Crop Over Festival, which is the carnival in Barbados, and you turned it into a science fiction narrative. It's this really wonderful, like alternative history, alternative world of Barbados, but they use the cultural folklore there to actually create this satirical, wonderful, like adventure story. It's almost like, it reminds me so much of like Spirited Away, but there's pirates, and it's like political satire, and it's quite wonderful, and it's beautifully done too. And this is, I'm hoping to do like a sequel for this. It's really, really great. I'm gonna stop talking because there's other things I could tell you guys about. One thing I do want to mention right quick is that we're doing a Afro-Caribbean, Afrofuturist version of the Count of Monte Cristo that's set in the Caribbean 400 years after the polar ice caps melt. So it's still a pirate story, but it's solar punk. And we actually have yeah, so it's because people forget that, Dumas was a Black man, the Count is based on his father, anyway, never mind. Yeah, we can move on. You can come back to me. I want Gina to talk.
Oh, that's great. I'm really looking forward to these. So Gina, in your introduction, you mentioned this idea, this mission statement of a graphic novel on every bookshelf. And as we're going to be looking at some of the books that you've got coming out or that have come out from Random House Graphic, could you talk about how those fit into that mission statement?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think that the mission statement, a graphic novel on every bookshelf, works in at least two different directions. Because one of the directions means that we are making comics for everyone. And another of them is that we are getting comics to everyone. So one is about the creation side of things, and then another aspect is about how do we reach a broad general audience in the United States. So tackling the first one first, at Random House Graphic, when we think about every bookshelf, every reader, what we think of is kind of starting at just when kids are old enough to understand narrative pictures, which is like 4 or 5, all the way through the end of our age range, which is up in college. And then Random House Adult has Pantheon, and they can produce graphic novels for the next readers after that. So we look at that age range of young kids, middle grade kids, YA readers, and we look at what those books need in different age categories. As far as younger readers need more simply paneled books, they need stories that are shorter, they need language that's more straightforward. Middle grade readers have another layer of sophistication. YA readers have very teen focused stories about kind of the coming of age experience, very character driven narratives. And we look at that expanse of books across age categories and then also across genres. Because not every reader is going to be drawn to a fantasy book or a nonfiction book or a science fiction book or a mystery. So we make all of those kinds of books for all of those readers. And then beyond that, we look at who our authors are and where our stories are coming from. Because if we're really making graphic novels for every bookshelf, we want queer authors to be telling queer stories. We want BIPOC authors to be telling BIPOC stories. We want neurodiverse authors to be telling their stories. We want to display kind of every experience, from things that are kind of all the way on the young and silly end, from like Mika Song's Donut Feed the Squirrels, which is a book for 4 to 8-year-olds about 2 squirrels who would like to have some donuts, and the local donut food truck does not serve squirrels, so they decide to pull a heist caper. So from that, on the very younger end of things, to more serious middle grade fantasy adventures like Carrie and the Night of the Forest, or autobiographical middle grade like Lucy Knisley's Stepping Stones, which is actually the first middle grade graphic novel to be dealing with divorce, to fantasy adventures like Tom Picot and Karen Sachs' Aster and the Accidental Magic, or Sophie Escoves's Witches of Brooklyn, to, either silly or serious YA books from things like Jessie Zabarsky's fantasy adventure Witchlight, which is about a girl and a witch who have a coming of age journey where they travel together and fall in love and figure out the magic behind their world, to more contemporary books like Trong Le Nguyen's The Magic Fish, which is a story about a kid trying to come out to his Vietnamese immigrant parents and figuring out how to create a shared language for themselves through fairy tales where he can talk about his experience. So that's one aspect of the thing. It's like all the different kinds of books that we're making and all the more books that we're making every year that each has a different audience, that each has a different experience. And then the next one is, how do we reach readers? How do we get readers in the United States today, which is a country where not as many people I personally think that not as many people as should be reading are reading. Possibly you all share that opinion. How do we get them excited and engaged with books and with comics? And are comics a good way for readers to get excited and engaged in books if they're not as familiar with prose reading, if they're not thinking about the kind of reading that they do of newspapers and magazines and the internet as quote unquote reading? So that's something that we, as part of Random House, they have an amazing infrastructure for us that just gives us the opportunity to have all of these partnerships with academics like yourself, teachers, librarians, booksellers, even people like, managing box stores and all of these spaces where we can get graphic novels into spaces that traditionally have been dedicated to books before, and also spaces that get young readers in them, with the idea of having books for kids as soon as they are able to hit that narrative panel comprehension all the way up through when they're adults. So if kids are coming into books being like, I like this, I'm interested in this, we'll have something for them to read all the way up through the point when they get to John's books and Kendra's books, and can dive off from Suncatcher or The Magic Fish into Megascope and Graphic Mundi.
That's great. Gina, I just want to say too that I love the work that you did when you were at First Second. So I was really excited when this when it got announced that you were doing Random House Graphic, and this seems to live up to the expectations. And from everything everybody's talked about so far, I've like the future scholarship that's going to come out from these books is just like circling through my head because I think not only is these are great books to, as like Gina you described, appealing to this level of readers, but I feel like there's so much that can be said about these works to promote them that way. And that kind of brings me back to Kendra's stuff, because one of the books I was curious about that was showing up there was the Kovet Chronicles, which of course is incredibly timely and feels like a book that fits into a lot of different classes that we could all be teaching right now too. So Kendra, could you talk a little bit about that and some of the other books?
Yeah, sure. Let me start just briefly with the other 6 there. Those are all translations, 4 from French publishers and 2 from German publishers. And that sort of raises a set of marketing challenges, which maybe we can talk about a little bit later on. But the point is that these are written by non-native English-speaking authors, but the stories they relate really are universal. And it's about the idea of drawing these stories to an Anglophone readership that for which these haven't been accessible, and creating connections there and affinities across cultural lines. So The Parakeet is by a pretty well-known French graphic novelist and it's a true story about growing up with a mother with bipolar problems with schizophrenic tendencies. And Crude is an amazing graphic novel. It's a memoir by Fajardo, who was one of the Ecuadorian lawyers who was fighting against Texaco Chevron at the time to address all of the environmental degradation and the damage they did to the habitats or the environments for indigenous peoples there. The Body Factory is more of an instructional kind of take, and that's a history of amputation and prosthetic development. Twister is the story of a swimmer who had an accident. It's partly fictionalized and became a quadriplegic overnight, and the story of his recovery. It's uplifting. It's a nice story. Next one, Dirty Biology, the X-rated story of the science of sex. That's pretty self-explanatory. It's more instructional and it's really funny, I think. And then Fat is a translation from a German graphic novel and it's pretty intense. It's about a woman's struggles with an eating disorder. So we're really excited about bringing those 6 books to Anglophone readers. And then Kovet Chronicles, was not planned when we were planning the imprint. And then of course, COVID, the pandemic hit, and it seemed like a good project to take on. This is actually a charity project. So all of the contributors, and we've got more than 70 contributors who are writers, artists, letterers, and so forth. They've all donated their work, which is pretty amazing. And then in turn, the press will be donating proceeds from sales of the book to an organization that I can't quite reveal at this point. That's all coming together. But yeah, I mean, the thing about Kovet Chronicles, I'm sure you've all seen there's been an explosion of COVID comics on the internet, the Nib, and there's at least one digital anthology, Heroes Need Masks, that's been published. And then a lot of artists posting their work on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, which has been super great. This project, we put out a call in April for this project and have been collecting submissions pretty much through October. So it's a six month project. And what's sort of fascinating about the project, I think, is that, when we started collecting, we thought maybe this would be a short-lived thing, and, hopefully we'll get the book out before COVID is sort of a distant memory that nobody wants to think about anymore. Sadly, I think when this book hits, even if a vaccine is available in February, we're all still going to be carrying the weight of this. You can see the scale of this whole experience is reflected in these stories from personal experiences, either with the illness or with losing a loved one, or having to learn to quarantine or homeschool and that sort of thing. But we've seen the how the impact of COVID has pretty much disrupted the world on a more systemic level. So there are comics in this piece about not just personal experiences with the disease and with learning how to respond to it, but also some of the social protest that has arisen, the political issues. There's one comic in the collection that compares world leaders' responses to the pandemic, using the conceit of baseball cards. And so each 7 world leaders have their own baseball cards, and we've recorded stats on how they have performed well or not so well, which is kind of cool. So anyway, I think it's really rich in the number of themes that it takes on, and yeah, I'd be interested to. I hope it goes into the classroom, and I'd be interested in talking with people who do adopt this for the classroom to see what kinds of conversations you're having with your students and responses you're getting from your students. But the other thing about it, just not to go on too long here though, is it underscores one of the consequences we'd like to see from publishing books in Graphic Mundi, and that is getting people to embrace the idea of community in spite of differences. And this project was a perfect example of people coming together as a community, sharing their experiences. And for me, working on editing this collection over the summer was a godsend, because I made new friends. I was working with some of my graphic medicine artists who I've published before, and everyone coming forward, sharing their stories. And it was really an honor to work with all of these people. And I felt like I was developing a community, and I hope that the artists, as they were working on the project, felt the support of the community. I hope that readers, when they read the book, feel the power of community, because there are some really sad stories, as you might expect, but there's also some hope in the volume, one of which is people coming together to share creative ideas, to respond in positive ways. And I'm really excited about the book. It's been a really great experience to work on. And it's huge. It's 200, it may end up being 288 pages. It's 64 comics.
Wow.
And I was trying to get a range of experiences and perspectives, and I feel like it's balanced out pretty well. Yeah.
That's great. I was just like, when the shutdown happened and all our classes went online, Qiana and I had that happen at the same time because we're the same system. I was in the midst of having my students doing an autobiographical comics project. And in the past, when I've done it, they all end up doing graphic medicine for some reason. Like, this is how I injured myself in 2nd grade or something like that, or I ended up in the hospital. And this time, because of that, because like this happened at that transition, they all did like quarantine comics independently of each other. And I thought, so when I saw this, I thought that connected to my own experience in teaching students and making comics in that class.
Well, listening to all of the range of stories and publications that you all are putting together, this is terrific. And I want to echo something that Andy said earlier about sort of seeing. I mean, I'm thinking of names of scholars who work in some of the areas that you all are producing titles in. And I'm thinking of books where these comics can be referenced. I want to ask, going back to something that I heard for instance, in Gina's remarks about preparing and thinking about how readers will receive these stories, and Kendra referencing, for instance, the hope that some of them will go into classrooms. Comics are known for having really deeply invested reading communities, obviously. Whether we call them fandoms or not, there's an expectation that readers will want to sort of engage with the stories, often the serial comics, of course, but graphic novels too, whether it's through cons or cosplay or transmedia adaptations, or even just writing a letter to an editor. And so I'm curious about how you all think about this engagement with readers, and how you are imagining how you'll develop reading communities. especially I'm thinking about that reference to classrooms. Is it really about getting these books in classrooms now, or are there other ways that you are engaging readers and fans? And anyone can take this question up.
Okay. Oh, I'll
John,
start.
you can start.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I was like, yeah, I have some definitely. Well, obviously I'm a professor of media, right, and also a comics creator. So I created an advisory board, which actually Qiana is on, made of scholars, primarily scholars who will teach these books, or actually to help with guiding the line, because it's I want to make sure that I'm putting out work that is relevant and that is exciting and appropriate, so I wanted to have a really solid, and it's a large board because I need help. So yeah, so that's one of the things that I wanted to do is reach directly out to the people that I know teach the work, and would use the books, but also may have something to say about the content. And in fact, Kenitra Brooks, for instance, is on our board, and she actually is ending up being an author for one of the projects, actually, because she's so invested in the story. She's like, "Well, I could actually adapt this story," and I was like, "Okay, well, let's do that then." So yeah, and I think so that's one aspect, and the other thing is I feel that because of this new interest in like speculative work around the African diaspora, it has been because of various reasons, that there is a new audience that I feel is untapped that I think would really love what we're trying to do with Megascope. So.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that also,
Sure.
because I am going to have a board. I'd like to use I think the value, some of the value that the board will bring to the press is helping us, well, bring their academic and teaching ideas and networks to the imprint. I think that will be really invaluable. And then beyond academic audiences, when the day comes when we can start getting back on the conference circuit, that's a great place to develop networks and find a following. We're also planning a newsletter, which I hope will get some sort of following, and I'm tossing around the idea of getting my board members involved in creating content for that newsletter, which I think would be great. That's just an idea at this point that we haven't fully executed. But and then of course social media, we're relying a lot on Twitter and Instagram just to sort of tease the audiences at this point. That's a conscious effort on the part of my brilliant marketing colleagues, that they're sort of putting out minimal information about the projects, teasing people to want to know more. And then at some point, when our website goes live in another week or two, we'll have fuller information there. And hopefully we'll develop a following for the website, for Twitter, Instagram, and so forth.
Yeah, as John and Kendra have been talking about, a lot of the community right now is online. So we think about reaching people in many of those same ways, in conventions, in virtual conventions like this one, in social media, in newsletters, in all of those ways. But at Random House Graphic, we also have the interesting community building challenge that when your readers are from age 4 to teenager, they age out of their books. So, I mean, I know a lot of people, like including myself, who will read a squirrel donut heist caper aimed at 4-year-olds and be like, "This is great. I will read it again." But that's really not our target audience. We want kindergartners and first graders and second graders to read those books and then, come back to the next book in the series, which is going to be about an apple pie based heist caper. But then we want them to move on to a new age of book and make a community, rather than being focused around like the specific book or author, being focused around reading graphic novels and engaging with graphic novel readership. So all of those different online outlets are things that we do. we also look at ways to build community and support for our authors, and not just our authors, but the other authors in the industry. And what do they need to be having the best health and safety and resources to make good, thoughtful graphic novels? And what can we do to make their experience publishing easier and better and more informed? So we think about that. And then we also, because our readers age out of our age categories so quickly, we also think about the other ancillary communities like booksellers, and making community and connections between all the different bookstore owners and buyers who love graphic novels and kids graphic novels. Making connections between the librarians who are excited and invested in graphic novels, making connections between us and our work in communities like this comic scholarship one, and between us and elementary and secondary educators as well. Who are those people out there who are doing this work and talking to kids who we can connect with and also make connections with? Because I think this industry only gets better if we all know more people who are excited about engaging with this work and can support each other.
That's excellent. I hadn't thought about aging out as being a challenge in the way that you've put it, especially when you hear that like Dog Man sells more books than anything ever selling right now. But that I can see how that would be a challenge in keeping readers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fun and interesting one. And you get the situation where like sometimes you have like whole families where it's like, okay, the older kids are reading this book and the younger kids are reading this book, and they're excited next year to get up to the age of this book. But it's definitely a different situation than, me as a college student or adult reading, the letter column in the back of a comic or a science fiction fantasy magazine, where I'm like, oh, this editor is responding to this, and I can continue to be the fan of this work and this editor's work for the next 50 years of my life.
Right.
That I don't know that Dog Man is going to have a place, have the same kind of immediacy in the reader's mind for that long a time, though the hope is that those people will then love the book so much that they'll introduce it to their own children and their own nieces and nephews and other kids that are in their lives, even if they are not the right age category for it.
That's neat, because I think about like you've got Lucy Knisley's book coming out, right? And a reader reading that and then kind of growing into her other work. That seems like it's just a really exciting opportunity for a publisher, but also and for a creator, but for those kids too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I have one more question, and then I think if there are any others, you might have time for one more after that. And this makes me go back to a comment, John, that you made about Kenitra Brooks writing, going from being a professor, she's still a professor and an editor, but to actually writing comics.
Yeah.
Comics critics have a long tradition of publishing their work in comics form as comics, and you are an example, but also people like, I'm thinking about Scott McCloud, and we think about Will Eisner and Nick Suzanne is right, who are scholars who also produce comics. And so I'm wondering, even if that particular type of work is not necessarily the right one for your particular imprint, what kinds of tips or strategies would you offer to scholars who may be watching this, who want to make that transition from doing traditional scholarship to actually doing their work in comics form? Because not everybody can do it.
That's totally true.
Or do it well.
Other thing is like, if you're really passionate about it, I mean, obviously, if you're a scholar or something, hopefully you're like super passionate about it, right? I would say that if you are stronger as a writer, then find a partner. Go. It's a great opportunity to go to a different silo, so to speak, because you know how like in university spaces, like everybody's all siloed up. You work on the same thing, and you're in the sciences, and somebody's over in English, and you guys have the same hobbies, and you should be hanging out and making stuff together. Go. It's a perfect opportunity for like a scientist to go to the art department and say, hey, I want to make a book about physics. Okay, let's do that. So I think that's the thing. I think because comics are a great opportunity to do collaborative work. Because Kanitra's not drawing the book she's doing. Actually, Ashley Woods is.
Oh, okay, that's terrific.
Yeah. So they're working together, and actually, it's an opportunity for you to learn more about process. But I think start small. The other thing too is like, don't try to make a graphic novel this is like a 500-page Ulysses kind of style graphic novel. Start with something small. Start with a comic strip and then work up. Same thing with any kind of writing. And honestly, write a short story before you can write a novel, kind of thing. That's what I would say.
And I'm guessing, because I know so many comic scholars who are interested, for instance, even in graphic medicine, and who are telling their own stories through comics form. One of the wonderful things about ICAF is that we have a growing number of participants now who take sketch notes, and we post and share them on social media.
I love sketch notes.
Yeah. So
I went to the.
I'm
sorry.
sorry. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say I was fortunate enough to speak at the as a Center for Cartoon Studies, right? And there was one guy. What did you say?
Up in White River Junction.
In White River Junction, yep. And there was a student there who he always drew like his notes, and he would make a copy and give you the notes. And I was like, oh, that's so awesome. Yeah, so sketch notes, they rock. So
they do, they do.
Yeah, I would just add to that and I don't yet have experience working with an author on this kind of multimodal analysis project, although I'm in conversation with some people. I do think this kind of work could find a place in our graphic medicine book series, which, as I said, is going to be primarily scholarly. But the first question I would have for these kinds of authors is I would try to get a clear sense of who their target audience is, because I know sometimes scholars like to, people who work in multimodal work, write the text and use comics, sometimes think that comics can help make ideas accessible to non-specialists, and so they're aiming to perhaps cross over to other kinds of audiences like maybe policy workers or people who work in advocacy, and so that's the first thing that I would want to be clear on, because as a publisher we'd want to make sure that we could reach that market, and yeah, and the other thing that I just think in terms of producing the work and starting conversations with publishers, I would think an earlier connection with a publisher would be better, because I have seen examples of multimodal scholarship that I find is not always easy to read, because sometimes the type is too small, or and so I think getting some input maybe from a publisher as you're thinking about the project, and before you finalized all of the drawing, could be helpful, because you could get some tap into some of a publisher's expertise, especially a design department, to help you think about creating the art and the page so that it's more publication ready, and you don't have to do a lot of redrawing and revising.
Yeah. And I think that there is also, there's another level of this where if you're not thinking about, having your scholarship published by Kendra or John, if you're doing it for a blog or a magazine, just starting out a drawing is great. We have all seen Randall Munroe's XKCD, and he is the master of the stick figure. but I bet everyone on this panel and listening to this panel could draw a stick figure, at least one stick figure that is half as good as Randall Munro's. And, from there, it's smooth sailing. There's lots of great books. I always recommend Jessica Abel and Matt Madden's Drawing Words and Writing Pictures as a great intro textbook from starting out from like, I know how to draw a stick figure to thinking about panel and structure and all of those elements. And Linda Berry also does workshops. So if you want to get over your can I draw? Am I the right person to draw? If you are planning to try this out rather than to embark on a graphic novel for publication, getting some of her books, trying her exercises, it's a great way to go from, I don't know if I can do this to whatever I do will mean something and convey something to people. And it takes practice to get to this is conveying what I want to convey to people. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go through all the intermediate steps and, look at and publish and think about all the intermediate steps. I also just think that there's something that's really charming and lovely about things like book reviews and essays and commentary that's in the comics form about commentary. Every time I see it, I get a little flutter in my heart because I'm like, this person put so much time and care and effort into thinking this out and writing it out and drawing it out. And I really appreciate it every time I see it. And I think that it should be something that people approach with the knowledge that there is that excitement in the reception rather than approaching it with, fear and apprehension.
I agree. I really like the way you put that. And it occurs to me hearing this conversation that I don't know if I can step back enough from this to make assessments about trends, but 10 years ago, we were all talking about Kickstarter, and Kickstarter still exists, obviously, and is even bigger than ever. But it occurs to me that a number of the creators that you all are working with would have gone that approach. Again, about 10 years ago. Kickstarter's been around for a decade, right? About several years ago. Right. And so it makes me wonder, in terms of the benefits then of talking to an editor at an imprint now in this day and age where there is so much variety, what they would gain versus going the crowdfunding route. And I say that knowing that folks on Kickstarter also have editors too. There's people who have lots of different relationships with crowdfunding sites, but is that being able to work with an editor to be able to talk with these marketing teams, would those be some of the benefits then of going with these imprints and making those choices instead of, like the Kickstarter example? My speculation.
I think when you do a Kickstarter, what you're doing is you're able to do exactly the thing that you want and directly reach the audience that you're engaged with already, and hopefully some more people. Hopefully, I always feel like people's thought is that they're going to do Kickstarters and then not just reach their existing fan base, but get a few more readers and maybe many more readers, depending on your Kickstarter. If you're in Ngozi Ukazu, you do a Kickstarter and then get all these new readers, right? And that's great. Like if you are like, I'm doing exactly the thing that I want, what I want is to, reach my readers. And that is a, financially successful aim for me. That's awesome. On the publishing end of things, what we offer is that we not only reach those existing readers, we reach out through all of our different communities of contacts, the teachers, librarians, booksellers that I keep talking about, and make sure those people are all aware of the book so that they can engage with the readers they know as well as an author's own readers, the fans that they've already kind of gathered. And then in addition to that, the other thing a publisher offers is infrastructure, where we have an editor, we have a designer, we have a marketing and publicity person who are all dedicated to Random House Graphic, and they know comics. They spend all of their time doing comics. So when someone signs up to work with us, they know they'll have a sounding board and people who work on every part of the process, from doing the contract of the book, to doing the design of the book, to choosing the paper of the book, to knowing what boxes we should ship things in. Kind of all of those parts are people who are really experts in this and can work with the author to give them the best advice about making the kind of book that we think will expand their audience in the way that they and we want.
And I think also a marketing department at a publisher can help to get attention for the work among major media outlets. And that can certainly help a creator build their own platform and get recognition beyond their circles. So I think that could be helpful.
Awesome.
Wonderful. So I think we are coming to the close of our hour. We are almost there. Anything that I've forgotten or overlooked, Andy?
No, that was great. I really enjoyed listening to these descriptions of these different lines and these different ideas about publishing. And I'm really excited to see these books come out. So really thanks for sharing those with us.
Thanks for your interest.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it.
It was great.
I'm excited about everybody's line.
So our hope is that one day, maybe we'll be in person, who knows when, we could actually do a panel like this in person. But for now, we appreciate you joining us virtually.
Oh, yeah.
And I just want to wrap things up by encouraging everyone to visit internationalcomicartsforum.org to see links and information about our blog and the other virtual panels featuring some of the scholars who were initially going to be presenting with us at SPX. Remember that way back in September, but they're still here, and they'll be sharing their work online. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.